Hi, Faiza.
Hi, Professor Galdi. How are you?
Good. Thank you. It's great to see you.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for accepting our invitation and joining. Am I audible? Like,
You are.
okay,
Yes.
awesome, awesome. All right. Okay, good afternoon, everyone, from freezing New Hampshire. Good morning or good night to our speaker who is joining us from Singapore, and it is very, very early in the morning there. Welcome to the Conversation of South Asia series. This is a collaboration at Dartmouth College, which features prominent monographs linked to the field of South Asia, South Asian studies at large. And this initiative is based at the Department of Asian Languages, Societies, and Cultures at Dartmouth College. And we are sponsored by the Bodos Family Endowment Fund for South Asian Studies. My name is Faiza Rahman, and I'm the convener of this conversation series. I'm a postdoctoral fellow in the Society of Fellows, and I'm a lecturer in the Department of Religion here at Dartmouth. We are communing today for a book conversation on the fascinating monograph titled Access to Power, Electricity, and the Infrastructural State in Pakistan, which has been authored by Professor Ijlal Naqvi. To introduce him, Ijlal Naqvi is Associate Professor of Sociology at the Singapore Management University. He is also the Associate Dean of Curriculum and Teaching at the School of Social Sciences at the same institution. Professor Naqvi is a sociologist of development with interests in political sociology and development studies. He is a multi-scalar, mixed methods researcher and uses a range of techniques from ethnography to hierarchical linear modeling to move beyond the limitation of any one vantage point in his research. And that is what makes his book a very fascinating and interesting study, particularly being based in Pakistan. Um, to introduce our respondents, our first respondent is Professor Jo Galdi, who is Professor of Data and Decision Sciences at Emory University. She is a historian of capitalism, a scholar of history who uses machine learning, statistics, and other big data methods to approach the traditional concepts of the humanities. Her scholarship, which is of a very broad range and very eclectic in intellectual terms, spans the subjects of land rights, history of state expansion, landscape, and ordinary people's experiences as they relate to all of the above. Our second respondent is Professor Benjamin Bradlow, who is an assistant professor of sociology and international affairs at Princeton University. Professor Bradlow is jointly appointed in the School of Public and International Affairs and the Department of Sociology at Princeton. His research makes connections between climate change, urbanization, technological change, and the political challenges for democracy that confront societies across the globe. And in recent news, his multiple award-winning first book, Urban Power, Democracy, and Inequality in Sao Paulo and Johannesburg, was published in October 2024 by Princeton University Press and was included in the series Princeton Studies in Global and Comparative Sociology. Thank you all for joining us. And I would now like to invite Professor Naqvi to give us an overview of his monograph and share his slides.
Thanks, Faiza. Thanks for that very kind introduction. Also, just want to take a moment to thank Dartmouth for bringing us together for this event, and Faiza in particular for bringing together such fantastic panelists. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Uh, how's that? Can you see my slides?
Yes, perfect.
Great. Uh, let's start then. Um, so this book starts with the study of a problem, or really that's what motivated it. That Pakistan desperately wants to meet its electricity demand, but usually doesn't. And what does that mean in practice? It means that on any given day, Pakistanis anywhere across the country will be without power. It's a phenomenon known as load shedding, a rolling blackout, which means essentially that you and your, the neighboring regions of a city or wherever you might be will essentially take turns being rationed power by a state utility, which is unable for multiple reasons to supply sufficient electricity to serve everyone. Um, every Pakistani has an opinion on this. We all suffer with it. And I picked this topic because I wanted to study the state as it mattered in people's lives on an everyday basis. And electricity has been consistently at or near the top of the political agenda since Pakistan's founding, essentially. It's the impact of this problem is probably 2% of GDP growth, whether it's plus or minus a little bit, but it's massively consequential. You can imagine that being compounded over decades. It's been the subject of foreign assistance from the United States, Asian Development Bank, World Development Bank, but also part of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. It's the subject of massive popular dissatisfaction, and I can't understate that really. And yet the trouble persists. So the story is not just that a state that has many poor governance outcomes has one more bad governance outcome, but that this problem continues over time. And despite no lack of desire and everyone concerned really wanting it gone, we can't get rid of it. Um, so I'll talk briefly about why. This one slide will give you the heart of the reasoning why Pakistan has so much trouble solving its electricity crisis. So if you start on the left, you can look at electricity generation. And so electricity generated is sent out through a national grid that has to be served to end users, called consumers in electricity jargon, at distribution companies. So distribution companies are regional monopolies that between them cover the entirety of the territory of Pakistan. They not only distribute the electricity, they're supposed to collect revenues. That's the key part because their revenues have to feed the whole system. And any shortfall in revenues from them, which is the persistent issue, has to be made up somewhere else. So the state provides subsidies and other forms of fiscal transfers. It's locked into long-term power purchasing agreements with the various investors that have that provide power to the national grid. Um, and the state's inability to continue to provide those fiscal transfers means that the system is unsustainable, and every time oil prices go up, the crisis will spike. The scale of the problem is such that around 2015, one World Bank study found that the subsidies for residential consumers exceeded health spending in the country. So that's the amount of sort of just the money, attention, effort that goes into supporting electricity within Pakistan. Um, I wrap this up in a theoretical framework I called Infrastructural State, with inspiration from many scholars, including Joe Galdi, who's here with us today. And there's a few elements here but I won't dwell on the theory. So one is the dominant paradigm of development, which is really drawn from institutional economics, focuses on formal institutions, and I want to make an argument about the way that informality is wrapped throughout everything that we're interested in. And the previous slide, I mean, I explained to you what the problem is. This is actually well understood. We know what the problem is in Pakistan. We have a reasonable idea of what a well-functioning electricity sector looks like, but we can't get there. And that inability to make the change is of crucial interest. I want to make an argument that is based on looking at the state as a set of nested fields, like essentially vertically nested city within nation and province, and the individuals and their neighborhoods within the city. And that the things that we're interested in are emergent system characteristics driven from below, which is part of what makes them so resistant to change. This is, I take electricity as a point of entry for studying the state, and we can look across the material infrastructure of electricity as it connects households and businesses into the national grid and to the national challenges. And lastly, it's presented as a problem, and I approach this in terms very much of problem-solving sociology, which is an initiative convened by Monica Prasad among others. But this is not to look only at what is lacking or what is absent. Instead, I want to very much focus on how this system works the way it does, and the way that this is inequality by design, i.e., that it's the product of very conscious decisions that serve a strategic understanding of what the state is and how it should work and whom it should benefit. So the question of state capacity is at the heart of this. This draws a lot on Michael Mann and infrastructural power. In short, what can the government achieve within its territory? A key concept is transmission and distribution losses, which is essentially electricity that is supplied to the system, but is never billed, right? A further problem beyond that is that much of the electricity that is billed is not paid, but losses refer to what is not billed, meaning that no one's ever going to pay for that electricity. You have to compensate somehow, increasing prices, but generally speaking, this is where the distribution companies don't generate enough revenue to cover the costs of producing the electricity. So here's a map that shows you how electricity losses are distributed across the state of Pakistan. Um, and green is good in this instance. The one on the left is just transmission distribution losses. The one on the right is combined commercial losses, meaning whether or not people actually pay the bill when it is delivered. And for anyone familiar with Pakistan, you'll immediately recognize that the only green areas are in Karachi, the largest city, the economic powers of the country, and in the province of the Punjab, which is politically and to some extent culturally dominant. Uh, um, and these are you can say that these are the areas where the state is serving its citizens to the greatest degree. But in those other areas, the state is not absent. This is a chronically uneven state, but it isn't a failed state or a weak state. The lack of state capacity is not the whole story. Instead, it's the way that these relationships are generated from below, the governance relationships, the power relationships that produce these outcomes and make them resistant to change. That's what the book seeks to get into through the ethnographic work and through some of the statistical analysis that I present later. So I'll only give you a little bit of sort of empirical material um, due to time constraints, but this is from the city section. There's a national level of analysis, a city level of analysis, and an individual level of analysis in the book. This is from the middle. And the Kachi Abadi is a squatter settlement, um, essentially without formal land rights. And there's a few pictures. This is it's not a squatter settlement actually. This is the old city of Lahore, where I'm from, and you can see this is what electricity infrastructure in Pakistan looks like. A terrible jumble of wires on transformers that are often overloaded. Uh, Here is another look at that, but this specifically is what's called the kunda or the hook. You can see that literally a metal wire will be shaped into a hook and then placed onto a passing overhead line, which is every bit as dangerous as it sounds. But if you cleverly use half a soda bottle and sort of a wooden stick, you can put this thing up there. It's very visible, it's easy to see, easy to remove, easy to put up the next day, and very difficult to police in a dense urban setting such as this. This is actually where area more like where I did my field work. So this is a site in a commercial market in Islamabad. There's a clinic, there's a convenience store, a couple other shops, and this is an area actually with underground wiring, which is the best physical infrastructure plant in Pakistan for delivering electricity. And those boxes are then connected to all the facilities that are around. Underground arrangements are much harder to steal from. It's much, much more dangerous to sort of tap into these systems. That's one from actually right next to where I used to live, serving residential consumers. The doors were perpetually stolen. So this Kachi Abadi that I mentioned, they were really fixated on seeking formal land rights. And just because it's a squatter settlement doesn't mean that these people are poor. They're there because they're working in the surrounding areas, often at middle class households as sort of domestic staff, but also in government jobs. They sought what is called regularization or getting a certificate a no objection certificate to their occupancy of the land because this is necessary. You need to show that you have legitimate claim to the land in order to get an electricity connection. There's actually nothing to do with the electricity company. The electricity company could care less, would be happy to build them to get them to pay for electricity, but because they don't have land rights, they cannot get a formal electricity connection, which means basically that they used to have to steal it. They would say, it's our right to electricity, and they were one of the very, very few people who ever spoke about rights. But they made essentially a moral claim along the lines of Patriciati's political society about here we're human beings, we deserve to have electricity. And they would end up in negotiations with the utility when the utility did try to clamp down. So they came up with a rather strange arrangement, which was communal metering that was managed and facilitated by the Kachiabadi residents, by a sort of internal governance scheme, which is it solved the problem in a way. The Kachiabadi residents had electricity and they weren't always having to negotiate with the utility. But these arrangements varied very much by the specific settlement. Some of them had some embezzlement, and but on the other hand, there was a lot of informality. If you had trouble month to month, you would often get sort of leniency in meeting your bill, and that's actually not unusual from the formal system as well. But that some individuals within that settlement did find a way to get formal rights, and on doing so, they thought they had solved their problems, but they didn't. They just changed their terms of engagement with the state, and very often they were actually very ill-equipped to deal with the state on a formal basis. Now you're subject to different kinds of documentation, paperwork, and you don't have the benefits of the community that you were once working with. And so this is a little vignette uh, of a family which withdrew from the formal system. So they achieved a formal meter, which was their hope, and then they left. And there's other examples of a voluntary retreat from formality. It wasn't the solution to their ills that they thought it would be. This comparison is with a steel mill owner. So this is a man who has a Land Rover parked outside and an MBA from the US, an exceedingly wealthy individual. He has no trouble navigating the state, but he's the key line is the last one that um, the foundation of his relationship with the state. He says its foundation, it's money. That the state officials won't do for you an unpermitted thing, but you have to pay for your rights. So even within that formal system, it's a constant negotiation of how will I get what I'm actually entitled to. Um, so I wanted to show you a couple maps. And this is actually from Karachi. I'm showing them because they're better maps. It's from a later study that wasn't part of the book. But you can see a sort of center periphery um, layout in terms of the central regions are the ones where electricity bills are being bills are being delivered and paid. But when you break this down, right, each of those regions is about 500,000 people. When you break any of those regions down, you see this extraordinary unevenness and heterogeneity within any one of those regions, right next to each other. You get one area which is, paying its bills, and the other which is not at all. And so you dive all the way down into one of these in an area that's called Liari, which is kind of infamous for some of the informal settlements that are there, including Mucho Colony, which unsurprisingly at this point in time at least did not pay its bills. But other parts do. And they're right next to each other. And I wanted to point this out because it's the same physical infrastructure that serves these areas. It's the same people, it's the same offices, it's the same rules. The institutional structure is exactly identical, and the variation comes from the social formation that's being served. So to wrap up with a few conclusions, that how does a citizen secure service delivery in all of this? There's at times thefts, but it's mostly a question of negotiated compromise. Sometimes there are communal arrangements that take you out of the state and have you have a different intermediary. And the note that formality isn't an unqualified improvement over informality. Um, this was in service of an infrastructural lens on state building, and particularly to look at the unevenness, this inequality by design that reproduces relations of domination, that the lack of state capacity that the map showed is very much there, but that's not everything. Formal institutions are pervaded by informality, and the things that we're interested in are emergent phenomena. This is governance as an emergent compromise. The book tries to argue that national level problems are generated and sustained from below, but formal institutions are written from above. And there's very few ways to connect the two. So the last thing I want to leave you with is that actually I've been working on electricity in Pakistan long enough to see multiple, there's a change, sort of US backed reform efforts, then Chinese funded massive infrastructure projects. Um, and most recently, this is again, I mean, in a way, it's a Chinese influence, but the availability of cheap solar panels has meant that within the last 18 months to 2 years, Pakistanis on an individual basis have simply bought cheap solar panels, stuck them on their roofs of their homes, of their factories, and everything else. And already about 20%, in the first half of 2025, 20% of all electricity in Pakistan was produced by these solar panels. Um, about half might be on the grid in the sense that they can sell power to the grid, and the others are just like people are exiting the grid in order to solve their own problems. Utter rejection of what the state has to offer with massive consequences for how the utility can function. But that is for another project, but I'm happy to talk about it more if anyone's interested. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Naqvi. Before we move to the respondents, if any of the attendees have questions, please leave them in the chat and I can pose it to the respondents and our author. And moving on, I would invite Professor Jo Guldi for her comments.
Thank you, Faiza. And thank you so much, Ijlal, for that, for sharing your wonderful book with us. I so enjoyed reading this. It cracks open problems that I have pondered for the last 20 years. And I'm reminded the shock and familiarity of traveling to cities that have less infrastructure than other cities. So the shock and familiarity, I say the shock. When I was about 30, got a fellowship. I said I've been studying infrastructure in the West and I want to study it in India. There was a fellowship at Brown at the time, specifically for faculty who had never been to India. And I said, that's me, I'll go. And I met up with all of these infrastructure activists who were trying to solve problems like creating trash collection in cities where there was no trash collection. And often the panels, so this was in Chennai, was the first city that I visited in India. And in many of the neighborhoods where we were walking around, a panel of the sidewalk would be open, and such that a child, a dog, an elderly person not looking where they were going could have just fallen through perhaps 6 feet down to where the electrical panels were. And I remember just the shock of seeing these safety hazards and thinking, oh, this could be dangerous. And of course, these gaps, the literal gaps, represent these figurative gaps of where services are distributed. Where is the trash collected? Where is the electricity available? Where are water points available? Which was exactly what this group of South Asian scholars was trying to understand. I say it's familiar, both strange and familiar, because as I was thinking about Chennai and the missing sidewalk panels, and reading access to power, I found myself thinking not so much about Chennai as about Texas and Louisiana, which is where I grew up. So driving between Texas and Louisiana every summer to visit my grandparents, I would experience this phenomenon that is very familiar to anybody in the South. You would drive on highways that were smooth like a ballroom floor until you hit the Louisiana state line. And then suddenly you were driving on back roads with fragmenting tarmac and uneven gravel, barely repaired for the last 20 years. And this was the result of a kind of core periphery struggle that's very much like what Professor Naqvi has been telling us about. In the case of Louisiana, federal subsidies for highway building were withheld by the US government for decades because Louisiana refused to raise the drinking age from 18 to 21, which was also why New Orleans became a party city destination for all high school students in the South. You could drink there legally. Meanwhile, Texas highways were subsidized by oil money at the state level. So these two different kinds of pavement represented unevenness, real unevenness that was the result of core periphery dynamics, um, contested states, unevenly aggregated in very much the same way that Professor Naqvi tells us. So I've been reading Access to Power, thinking about what is familiar and what is unfamiliar as a scholar of Western infrastructure in this Naqvi story. And I find it very provocative, this question. So the next place that it takes me is to wonder about all of the different kinds of infrastructure. Because I think a naive perspective, my naive perspective at 30, visiting Chennai for the first time, thinking, oh, this is a place where sidewalks can have missing panels, where things can, that used to be, that were safe where I grew up are now unsafe. I've had reason to come back and to question that perception. After all, the informal structures around water points, around solar electricity, around capturing and producing electricity that we've been reading about have so many different kinds of instantiation. South Asia is also a place of immense creativity, immense flexibility when it comes to infrastructure regimes. When I teach the history of the British state, there is a progressive Whig narrative about how the government laid out generation after generation of improvements, sanitation, sidewalks, public parks, and then housing. But looked at from the year 2025, that 2026, that narrative starts to break down, especially on the last question, the question of housing. There was a period in the history of Great Britain, when housing was considered a form of infrastructure that should be rolled out according to rational pricing by a technocratic elite, by bureaucrats not paying attention to regional variation, ensuring that all citizens had a right to housing, a right to access housing. Both Great Britain and the United States have largely, most of the Anglophone world has retreated from that model. And housing is considered an asset, part of an asset portfolio that should be bid on. We're told that we need to solve the housing crisis by making it cheap to build, by eliminating zoning, for instance. So less bureaucracy, more pricing. So I wonder about how Chennai can't solve its trash collection, but New York City and San Francisco can't solve their housing. And I think about how the world as a whole is having trouble with the climate problem right now as another form of infrastructure. It's the governance of natural resources by a technocratic elite. We tried pricing it. Rolling out universal pricing strategies did not work, did not solve the problem. So we thread that needle just a little bit and see if it'll do any work for us. I'm going to scatter more questions than I have answers to. But I came to the conclusion in my early work on road building in Great Britain that infrastructure systems, new systems of paved roads, mail delivery, and so on in 18th century Britain created a new kind of commons, a shared space that everyone had access to. And that was really the great accomplishment, the idea that the shoemaker, as well as the rich man, had access to the road. You didn't have to pay at every bridge. You didn't have to pay 20 times going across one end of London to another. So infrastructure, when it works, often creates a new kind of commons where everybody has equal access. And I moved thinking about Professor Naqvi's book and hearing him talking about it again, I'm noticing that one of the things that the citizens are saying who he interviewed is that they have a right. They have a right to electricity, and they assert this right by informal acts of tapping power lines. And yet the pricing system, redistributive as it is, has these energy subsidies that vary by state, they vary by industry, they're free from one government agency to another. So they're structured so as to not make a commons. Now, what Ostrom tells us about commons is that common systems don't work when the rules of equality aren't enforced. They do work when there are insiders and outsiders, and equal access is enforced. So I wonder about what it might look like to create an energy commons, which doesn't mean everyone can use as much as they want. It means that everybody has equal access and that that is somehow enforced. I wonder if that is useful. And I realize that I'm now pushing against some of Professor Naqvi's excellent arguments, but I have questions. I have questions about where he lands. So Professor Naqvi ends his book with questions about Weber and a technocratic elite. And I think his diagnosis of development in the 1990s is correct, that isomorphic regimes to institute uniform pricing did not work because of the reality. They ignored the reality of politics, the reality that a bureaucracy had to grapple with every day. But I'm coming to be a great admirer of Weber's and also of bureaucrats alongside informal the architects of systems. I think bureaucrats are often doing the best that they can with a system that they've been given, that they do understand technology, they do understand political dynamics. They're negotiating within those systems, and often they're hampered. They're not able to be as creative or as entrepreneurial as they might wish. And this is one of the stories that comes out in Theodore Porter's Trust in Numbers, where he tells us that in the origins of the École de Pont de Chaussée and the Army Corps of Engineers in the West, there was a moment where it became very important that those bureaucracies could keep secrets. They could have internal numbers that they didn't publish. They could decide on their own without pressure from anyone else in government which projects to prioritize. And they could do that on the basis of political questions which were separate from those of open debate. That allowed, he thinks, more creativity, more independence in those regimes, also occasional abuses of power. But is that flexibility something that Weberian systems should aspire to? Yes. Okay, so those are my provocations. I would love to hear a response. Thank you very much, Faiza, for organizing this, and to Dartmouth for hosting us. I look forward to hearing from my colleagues.
Thank you so much, Professor Guldi. I'm sure Professor Naqvi would have responses to all of these, and we will come back to him, but I will invite Professor Benjamin Bradlow for his comments first.
Great. So thank you to the organizer and to Ijlal for such a rich and thought-provoking book. I want to make 3 points. One about what the book accomplishes theoretically, one about a tension that it surfaces but maybe doesn't fully resolve, and one about where the argument might travel next. And if I recall correctly from prior conversations, Ijlal, I think this might be at least partially related to where you are actually going next. So the book's most important contribution, at least in the way that I read it, is to take something usually treated as a sectoral policy problem, which is that Pakistan doesn't produce enough electricity and can't collect enough revenue, and reframe it as a question about the nature of the state. So the move of treating the power sector as a set of nested fields, from interprovincial transfers down to the face-to-face encounters between, for example, a lineman and a consumer, lets Naqvi show how the same phenomenon, which is electricity losses, carries different meanings at each level while remaining materially connected through the grid. So this brings energy infrastructure into much closer conversation with literatures on the welfare state and urban service delivery than is typical. Most energy scholarship stays at the level of national policy, examining things like the mix of fuels, tariff structures, generation capacity. And to be quite honest, this is what I thought the book was going to be about. And I was kind of wondering why I was being asked to comment on this, because that's not precisely my area of expertise, but it soon became clear where this all fits in. The most urban service delivery scholarship focuses on things like water, sanitation, and housing, precisely the things that Jo was just talking about in her comments. And Naqvi shows that electricity sits at the intersection of these conversations in a way that neither tradition has really been able to capture on its own. The grid is simultaneously a national infrastructure requiring synchronization across entire territories, and it's a site of intensely local negotiation over who pays, who steals, and who gets served. So the tariff differential subsidy is both a fiscal instrument and a mechanism for holding together a fractious federation. Losses are both an accounting problem and a map of where the state has chosen to assert itself and where it hasn't. So this framing is what gives a book a unique critical edge. Reforms fail not because of insufficient political will, but because they misrecognize what the existing arrangements are. And this is not a deficit to be corrected. They are, as Naqvi puts it, a inequality by design. Strategic choices about who gets what, reflecting the actual balance of power among provinces, between center and periphery, and between rich and poor within cities. My second point is about a tension that the book raises largely implicitly. The framework draws on a lineage in which infrastructure construction is itself a mechanism of state formation. Towards the end, the book invokes the Canal du Midi, which generated capacities for more impersonal rule. Road building in Britain produced the legal principle of eminent domain. The hard work of building things out forces the state to develop new capacities. So Naqvi invokes this in the conclusion when he argues that the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, I think that's what CPC stands for, right? Because it relies on Chinese engineering, financing, and logistics, has not cultivated indigenous state capacity. Pakistan gets the benefits of power generation without doing the state building work. So I want to push this further because this points to a problem that the theoretical framework in the book begins to address. What happens when the state's interest is precisely in not building or in building in ways that avoid domestic political mobilization? Naqvi shows this clearly in the sense that Pakistan's reliance on imported fuels and foreign finance generation capacity is partly a way of bypassing interprovincial conflicts, the dam that can never be built, the gas fields that are too politically costly to exploit. The federal center would rather absorb enormous fiscal costs through the tariff differential subsidy than confront the political economy of its periphery. This resonates with what I found in my own comparative work in Sao Paulo and Johannesburg. In both cities, the extension of urban services was never simply administrative. It was a political act that reshaped who counted as a full member of the urban polity, a member of the city. In Sao Paulo, infrastructure provision is tied intimately to deepening democratic citizenship. Naqvi refers to a lot of this similar kind of literature through the relationship in Sao Paulo's case between housing movements and local government bureaucracy. In Johannesburg, a halting post-apartheid extension of services to townships was simultaneously an attempt to redress and a site of intense contestation over the terms of inclusion. In both cases, the process of building out infrastructure was inseparable from the politics of belonging. So what the Pakistan case adds is a scenario where the state is in effect opting out of this process entirely. This is not an instance of the absence of a state, and I think this book is absolutely right to insist on that. It's a mode of governance that systematically forecloses the kind of state building through infrastructure that the canonical literature on infrastructure has described. So I want to pose this as a question. Is the avoidance, are you arguing that the avoidance of domestic infrastructure building itself may be becoming a characteristic mode of statecraft in the contemporary global South? Not the extension of services as a mechanism of incorporation, but the management of energy access through externally financed projects that maintain existing power relations precisely by not requiring the state to build new relationships with its own population. And now my final point looks forward. The book notes the potential for solar and wind to reduce Pakistan's dependence on imported fossil fuels and mentions the possibility of Chinese-Pakistani cooperation on renewables. In fact, this has gotten a lot, this is a major issue in global politics and in the international press. But this issue is handled briefly, and that makes sense because of the timeframes that the book is looking at. But it's become a central question for Pakistan's energy future, and indeed for many states across the global South today. Particularly, many African countries are looking to Pakistan to see whether this may be a model that they should be pursuing in their relationships with China. The cost declines in solar and battery storage that have been driven by Chinese manufacturing have changed the calculus dramatically. And for a country trapped in the cycle that Naqvi describes, renewables with minimal operating costs could be genuinely transformative. They would reduce foreign exchange exposure, this huge issue in the Pakistani case, weaken the links between commodity markets and circular debt, and potentially decentralize generation in ways that might even support the local accountability missing in the cases described in this book. But if Pakistan's energy transition runs on Chinese panels, inverters, batteries, and financing, then the question about the Chinese-Pakistan economic corridor, whether China exports infrastructure without exporting infrastructural power, might apply with equal force. Does a solar-powered Pakistan dependent on Chinese supply chains have more energy security than a fossil fuel-powered Pakistan dependent on foreign oil? On the one hand, you cannot embargo sunlight, and the operating cost structure of renewables breaks the commodity price vulnerability at the heart of this book. On the other hand, maintaining and scaling a renewable system requires ongoing access to manufactured components ever increasingly concentrated in China. So this is a question that is also animating my current research on green industrial transitions in Brazil and South Africa. In both countries, the issue is not just whether to adopt clean energy technologies, but whether adoption will be accompanied by domestic industrial capabilities, or whether it deepens a pattern in which the global South is consuming technologies manufactured elsewhere. So Naqvi's framework gives us the right lens. Follow the material infrastructure, trace its connection, ask who benefits and who bears the risk. What his book makes clear is that the answer depends on the deeper political economy of state making, on whether states use the energy transition to build new relationships with their own populations, or treat it as one more opportunity to import solutions that leave existing power relations undisturbed. Let me close by saying that this is a book that rewards careful reading, and the ethnographic material in particular forms a compelling analytical core. It was in these ethnographic moments that I came to understand the theoretical thrust of the book most clearly. In showing how the rules of the game are constituted through encounters that no institutional redesign purely from above would be able to reach. And that finding travels well beyond Pakistan. Thanks very much for the book and for the opportunity to be part of this conversation.
Thank you so much, Professor Bradlow. We do have audience questions, but I want to ask Professor Naqvi if he wants to respond to some of the comments raised by Professor Galdi and Professor Bradlow.
Sure. I think I'd better do that quickly just to give people time to pose questions. But I wanted to thank Ben and Joe for those phenomenal comments. It's such a privilege to have such capable, informed, smart people read your work and give it back to you in ways that help you see it anew. And for a project that I've worked on for over 10 years, that's really a gift. And I thank you. Thank you both for that, for the new connections and insights that I see. It's another kind of shock and familiarity, Joe. Um, and maybe I'll just point to sort of one or two things that link your work, and I think the focus on climate, the question of solar in particular, and the last thing that Ben was mentioning about like what kind of response do we see is something that I do want to work on. And Joe's comments about the flexibility that bureaucrats can engage in. Bureaucrats are not limited. Bureaucrats are one more player in this game, and very often what I saw from bureaucrats is that they just want to get through their lives without sort of getting abused in turn by the extremely powerful individuals that are telling them to do X, Y, and Z that they have to do because they haven't got the kind of backing from the state that will allow them to enforce rules diligently. And as for, the just the Kachiabadi residents or whoever is trying to get their ordinary work done, they can and do show flexibility because they have tremendous capacity and knowledge. They are the ones who walk these power lines and engage with people on a regular basis. So there's a lot that can come through them. And that touches on, as Ben identified, the misrecognition that stymies governance reform and means that we see the same sort of solutions. I mean, it's not that these new institutional frameworks are necessarily bad. It's just not going to get you to the problem. Um, and this is maybe something that I see in terms of what solar does. The Pakistani response to with solar is astonishing, precisely because um, uh, the scale and speed at which this happens is remarkable. And people have done it entirely on an individual basis. I say people, but I also mean industries. There are substantial industries that have just literally covered their factories with solar power. But there is so much to be gained if that does become a commons. And I thank Joe for invoking Ostrom there. How can this become a commons, which is what the grid is supposed to be ultimately, right? How can it become a commons that helps people solve their practical problem, but then also um, becomes a basis for civic relationships that are so much more constructive than what people struggle with. So these are questions that are not solved in Pakistan or elsewhere. But I think Pakistanis can do a lot of work on this front, and I think there's also a lot in this space that's called electrotech, which is really like the technology that governs these relationships. What happens when each individual consumer now becomes a producer as well? You can have relatively affordable microgrids that are created. But if I have a microgrid in my house and I connect with my neighbor, we can set up sharing arrangements that allow this to become then a communal arrangement and so on. There's a remarkable amount that could be done from below without the guidance or buy-in from the state, but it could be so much better if the state was supportive, insightful, and took the strategic actions that really made it all come together in a constructive way. And what does the state want to do? Does it want to um, take the convenient imported option that doesn't make it do the hard work of state building that is inherent in infrastructure? Um, I mean, no, that's what Joe's book Road to Power is all about, and Ben pointed out as well. Will the state take that option? And I wonder if it might be forced to, because the motive power of change has relocated. It's not in the state. It's actually in independent decision makers, ordinary people who will absolutely buy the cheap solar panel and not think twice about sticking it on their roof and exiting from a state system that doesn't serve them. So there's a lot to be found there, and I'm hoping to discover that in new research. So thank you both so much for these comments. I really appreciated it, and happy to take questions and comments from the floor, the group that's out there as well.
So we have Dartmouth students and people from other institutions who've joined us. So one of the questions is, given that Islamabad is the capital, would you notice any difference in sociological findings between Islamabad and other outlier parts of Pakistan?
Sure. That's a great question, and one that I had to address in the book, and because also one that I had to address to people who are familiar with Pakistan, because the joke goes that that Islamabad's about 20 minutes from Pakistan. You sort of drive in any direction and out of the capital, and you'll get there. And it's true, even in the physical infrastructure plan. I showed those pictures of underground wiring. It's the only place in Pakistan where you find underground wiring. You can't throw a stone in Pakistan without hitting a sort of, a bureaucrat. It's where all the bureaucrats live. It's where that kind of work is done. In terms of levels of education, income, connectedness to the state, it's at its maximum peak in the city of Islamabad. And this is just to clarify that Islamabad has a service area which is larger and incorporates, basically the rest, more normal social fabric of Pakistan as well. But I did my research in that core central built up area. And I wanted to take it as a limit case, really, to show that even in this environment, informality was this pervasive. So that's the way I answered that. But it's a very fair question because Islamabad does not represent the average state. It represents, in many respects, the best of what this system can offer in terms of a functioning formal environment of people who are educated, capable, literate, numerate, sufficiently moneyed. And even this most barbarian manifestation of the Pakistani state still has these same problems that I talked about. So that's what Islamabad does in this study. Thanks for the question.
Um, Thank you. The other question is, again, it's a question by one of the students, and you do answer this question in the book. Actually, it is about, could you elaborate on how and why you chose ethnography for this study, and who was in your sample, which you address in the book, but you could elaborate for the students. And I believe that, I mean, I would just say that I think the study of electricity through ethnography, which is traditionally an anthropological method, that is, I think, what makes this book, that gives strength to this book. So how would you answer that?
So what you won't read in the book is that I went to UNC Chapel Hill, which is quite a quantitative sociology department, and I took plenty of methods courses, plenty of quantitative methods courses, and all of that. And I was fully ready to use those techniques in my dissertation work. And the problem was I just couldn't get the quantitative data that I wanted. So I had always intended to do an ethnography because I mean, there are many reasons for wanting to do ethnography. I like it. I enjoy it. I want to meet people. I want to hear their stories. I want to learn about their world through their eyes as they see it. And the other thing that I did, I mean, it's participant observation. I mean, I I can glibly say I didn't do anything useful. It's not like I worked at the utility. I didn't really help anybody there, but I watched them. I sat in those offices all the time and I watched them do their work. I watched people come how many times did I see people come to the officer concerned, present some paperwork, ask for a favor, explain this problem, say so and so, my uncle is so and so. Oh, someone did you get a call from this fellow, to make my introduction? That this was the work of the state being done. And it's not written down anywhere. You have to see it. You have to hear people talking about it and then hear them explain it. And then I had and you're supposed to have a list of proper questions and so I did semi-structured interviewing, which is often a nice way of saying that I'll just wait until I can actually ask the question that I want to ask, which is based on the situation that I'm in. And then so I think only once did I try and go through that list in a sequential manner of like I'm going to ask you this question and this one and this one. And it was nonsense because I got back all these very stilted, sort of formal answers. There's no problems here. We have no such issue. And you just wait until they actually need to deal with whatever's in front of them, and then you'll learn the real story. So I valued the ethnographic experience for me was really the learning experience. I wouldn't. at the Karachi data that I presented later, I had not been to Karachi to look at the electricity work until well after I got the data. And I was deeply distrustful of the quantitative data until I could go there and meet people and see it for myself and have more confidence in what I was saying reflected the lived reality of the place. But when I did get the quantitative data, which was much later, and it was is the kind of thing that was only possible once I had made the relationships by being sort of present and engaged in that system for a long time. Then I was able to get the quantitative data that I needed. And I could make different kinds of arguments, but I could make them at a scale that I wouldn't have otherwise been able to do. And so that I found that the two fit together, the quantitative analysis and the ethnographic work, in sort of building an argument that cross scales, which was ultimately something that I wanted to do to talk about national problems and how they were manifested and generated through local level engagements. But thanks for that question because I didn't have time to talk about the methods otherwise, and that's what I did for many years. So I'm happy to share that.
So we have a last question, which is a dangerous kind of question.
Mm.
Which political party has done the most has done the most damage or benefit to the electricity grid in Pakistan? And which party I don't think you need to answer that. Which party do you support? You don't have to answer that.
I don't support any Pakistani political party. I live in Singapore for a reason. But which one did the most damage or benefit? Okay, so maybe let's just mention that between 2013 and 2018, there was the PML and the Pakistan Muslim League Noon under Nawaz Sharif's prime ministership, and they explicitly campaigned on solving the electricity crisis. They coincided with the first wave of Chinese infrastructure investments. They built out power plants that in a way solved the grid problem. So I was sitting on the outside, almost worried. Have you taken away the sort of justification for my book? I was both excited for Pakistan and worried what it meant for my research. But in a way, they proved the claims that I was making by building out infrastructure without changing any of the underlying relationships, ultimately falling into the same set of problems of unaffordable power. So they worked intensively on that. They built out a ton of infrastructure, which was consequential. It also locked Pakistan into a cycle of fossil fuel commitments that were unaffordable and limiting. The real tragedy is that had they followed the actual Chinese model and gone renewable at that point in time, we might be having a very different story. But uh, it's not always fair to expect that level of foresight from policymakers. But they certainly addressed the issue most directly.
So, Ijlal, I have a question actually. I'm very
Please.
curious, particularly how you ended your response to Professor Guldi also, and also you have this direction in the book. Um, is your next exploration going to be on renewable energy in Pakistan? And if not, then I would be interested in knowing that if you have another monograph project, what would that be?
No, that's exactly it. I feel like the world has presented me this topic sort of on a plate. Like Pakistan's already charging down this path, so much so that it's looking like an exemplar to other countries in the global south. That what does it mean to so drastically, so quickly shift to renewables? It's distributed, which creates all kinds of amazing sort of energy security positive outcomes. It allows for all kinds of interesting things to be done. Which of these will resolve? How will the state respond? The state has responded so far by trying to limit the imports of solar panels, by limiting the payout of the net metering tariff, which makes it connected to the grid and helps the affordability of solar. So that's a topic that I would like to explore. I'm especially interested in the decentralized aspect of it. I can see it most prevalently when I go back to Lahore, which is where my family mostly is. It's literally everywhere. Stand on any rooftop, look in any direction. You can ride the monorail through the city and just see solar panels after solar panels. but what does it also look like in the outlying areas? So in the sort of agricultural lands outside of Lahore, you will find a big solar panel arrays in the middle of a field powering a tube well. So it's immediately shifting to agricultural uses as well. You find it in informal settlements because one panel will do things very cheaply for everyone. But I'm also curious what it means in the outlying areas of the country, which have historically been so poorly treated by the state, repressed, mistreated, and now they can deal with this problem themselves. So I'm very curious what it means um, in the rest of the country as well. So that's what I would like
Awesome.
to explore.
Okay, we don't want to let you go right now because we have some more questions coming in. So there's one by Professor Zoya Samin, who is a professor of history at the Aga Khan University and a dear colleague of mine. And she is asking, how might the recent solar rush in Pakistan transform the book's angle on top-down versus bottom-up negotiations of electricity?
Mm. Um, I would love for it to do exactly that. I'm speaking sort of as a just as a former citizen actually, but someone who'd love to see this problem resolved in Pakistan. I think that the bottom-up solution, I mean, frankly speaking, and Joe mentioned flexibility and informality being sort of pervasive, or creativity, really, what Pakistanis and South Asians might call jugad, right? Is like you have to work out your own problems. And Pakistanis are ready and willing, they're already on this path. Now, how can that be done in ways that leverages its decentralized nature, allows communities to make constructive decisions around the implementation of solar panel, and then renegotiate the power relationships, which I think Ben is correct to say that the state avoids it. If it doesn't have to address difficult questions of integration into the state and what citizenship means and why it doesn't persist with the deeply unequal forms of citizenship that exist across Pakistan, that could be forcibly challenged. And actually, it would be most forcibly challenged within the heartlands of the state, because that's where this transformation is most drastically taking place, is within the wealthier, more industrialized, more developed. I mean, they have the most resources, and they are opting out. Um, so I would love to see it forcibly renegotiated by ground up activity. And I think many Pakistanis are already thinking along those lines.
All right. Does Tomar have a question? I can see your hand raised, but I don't see your question. Okay. All right. I think we can, Alicia, can we wrap up?
Hi, yeah.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to Professor Joe Galdi, Professor Benjamin Bradlow, for being the respondents for the conversation. There are some the forms and paperwork that you have to do. Please do them so that we can give you the due honorarium for your time. And thank you so much, Professor Ijlal Naqvi, for joining us all the way from Singapore for this conversation. We try to be we try to pluralize South Asia as much as we can to move away from like the India centrism that, rankles the subfield a little bit. So we try to get as many scholars from Pakistan, Nepal, and Bhutan and other places of South Asia. So thank you so much for coming. This was a fascinating book to engage with, and we look forward to having